welcome to this Access webinar. Apologies for technical hiccups, which always seem to happen despite the best laid plans, but we are here now, and most importantly, we've got our speaker, which was the thing we were getting slightly nervous about. So Access is an ESRC funded network based at the Universities of Surrey and Exeter, which aims to champion climate change and environmental social science. And we see this webinar series as an essential strand of this work. I'm Kate Birmingham. I'm a professor here at the University of Surrey. I'm chairing the session today, and our speaker today, I'm really pleased to say, is Patrick Devine-Wright, who's our Access Director at the University of Exeter. He's Professor of Human Geography there, and a lot of his research over many years has been around renewable energy. He's going to speak to us today about how we can decarbonise. I was going to say recarbonise then, but that wouldn't have been right. How we can decarbonise society in ways that are place sensitive and fair. So Patrick is going to talk for about 35 minutes, leaving about 15 minutes for Q&A. We're going to record the session, but we won't record the Q&A. And the way in which we'll manage the questions is by the chat. So if you have questions or thoughts for Patrick as he's speaking, please do put those in the chat, and we'll kind of coordinate those here. And my colleague, Sarah Golding, will put them to Patrick at the end. The webinar aspect of this will be available online later on the Access website. So with no further ado, Patrick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate and Kirsty. I'll just try and share slides now. Okay. Let me try that again. Great, that looks a little bit more likely. Okay, can you just let me know that you can see?
That's perfect, Patrick, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks everybody. And yeah, very pleased to be here today and to be part of one of a series of webinars that Access is putting on around social science applications to different environmental problems. And what I'm going to be talking about today is that broader area of climate change mitigation, reducing carbon emissions, or decarbonisation, but taking a very particular social science perspective on that, which is bringing together concerns around place, geography on the one hand, the locations where climate mitigation happens, and on the other side, considerations of justice and fairness. And these are increasingly recognized, I think, essential attributes of how we decarbonize and how we move forward as a society. So, I mean, I won't spend too long here at all, but just to say that I've been working in this general area for about 2 decades now. And I come at it from, I guess, 2 essential disciplinary areas, psychology, environmental and social, and human geography. And I guess I've been interested in it as a kind of social problem in a sense for quite a long time, about the kinds of contestations that you get over the siting of large-scale energy infrastructures. So I'm not going to be talking today too much about how we change consumption, how we get people to use public transport or use less energy in their homes, that kind of demand side focus. Instead, I'm going to be talking about what energy specialists tend to talk about as the supply side. And over the years, I've been involved in a range of projects looking at different technology sectors or infrastructure sectors. That includes wind energy, which was initially very controversial in the UK and in England in particular about 15 years ago, but various other kinds of controversial energy infrastructures and sources as well, including high voltage transmission power lines, shale gas, the hydraulic fracturing of gas from underground sources, and more recently, and what I'll talk about a bit more today, are what we're calling the kind of net zero energy infrastructures. And CCUS here stands for carbon capture, utilization and storage, and hydrogen. And these are increasingly being talked about and funded and developed as infrastructures to try and reduce carbon emissions in various parts of the sector. And I guess the ideas on the right are really just to say that I've never really been the kind of academic who was happy just to write papers. I've always thought that it's important for the knowledge that we're producing in academia to be known about and hopefully used by people in stakeholder positions of different kinds, including policy. And that's led to various different kinds of engagements from the local level in Exeter and a community energy initiative right up to the IPCC. But all the time, it's the idea that social science might have something useful to offer, and therefore it's incumbent actually on us as social scientists a lot of the time to get out there and share that info. And obviously access is a very important part of that agenda too. So I'm going to talk about four main things today in this general heading of place and fairness in decarbonisation. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the context that we are in. Then I'll talk about some theoretical foundations, drawing on literatures in environmental psychology and human geography in particular over the last 3 or 4 decades. Then I will introduce a new framework, which has come out of a recent project I was involved in with researchers in 4 different universities funded under the IDRIC program about industrial decarbonisation. And then I'll finish just with a couple of resources and a nod to the Net Zero Task Force, which is an access initiative that is soon to be reporting and sharing its findings. So that's basically a quick summary. I'm aware that I only have about 35 minutes, so I will try to rattle through this. Don't worry if you don't get everything on the slides. I'm sure we'll be sharing them afterwards, so you don't have to take like rapid notes, but I'll try and cover the information as simply and clearly as I can. So for me, this is a fundamental starting point, an increasingly worrying one, I suppose. We live in a particular time, and it is a time of emergency. It's a time of urgency. And I suppose what I'm trying to get across here in this slide is that I think reflexively, as researchers, as social scientists, we have a number of different kind of ways of responding to this environment and climate emergency. On the one hand, it means I guess even more efforts being made to think about, well, where does our knowledge go? Does anybody know about it? Most of the time we write stuff that is written up in academic peer-reviewed journal papers, which is great, but most people don't read that out in the real world beyond the ivory tower. And I guess in access terms, the way we are approaching this is just to talk about what we call guiding principles in social science. And that's thinking reflexively about our own environmental footprints as teachers or researchers or people in management, whatever kind of positions we're in. We've got to think about our own impacts. And for me, that's an important question for our enduring legitimacy and credibility. Why would anybody listen to our expert pronouncements if, on the one hand, they can see that we're clearly behaving in ways as professionals that don't seem to tally up with these objectives? So take a look at the guiding principles on the Access website, because they are about the sustainability of social science, but also about how you marry that up with other key considerations like EDI, equity, diversity and inclusion, and the co-production of knowledge. So for me, that's quite important, thinking about how we do what we do, not just what we study as a topic of research. And I'll come back to that. But let's move on to place, which is one of the key concepts of today's talk. And I just wanted to start with this nice quote from Hayden's work back in 97. So place is a tricky word because it means, I think, so many different things to different kinds of people. It has a kind of an ease with it because it's a word that's used in everyday life. You can talk to your grandmother about place. You can talk to your neighbor about place. People kind of understand that London is a place, Liverpool is a place, Shanghai is a place, New York is a place. It's easy to talk about. But underneath that, there's an awful lot of complexity, and that makes it interesting on the one hand, but also very, very challenging as well. And I think key here from an academic point of view is to stress that how much it's used across different disciplinary boundaries. So we're looking at the 2 disciplines I've mentioned already, human geography, environmental psychology, but a wealth of other disciplines take place into account as well. It might be environmental sociology, landscape architecture, landscape planning. A lot of spatial disciplines are interested in ideas about place. But of course, what you find in social science is that every discipline or subdiscipline has its own particular take on it, its own definitions, interpretations, methods, and that adds to quite a lot of complexity, which makes it a challenge sometimes. And I guess the words on the right here are just to say that place is often used as a synonym for other things, and particularly the local. And that's not always helpful in my view, but it is useful to bear in mind these other often kind of flexible and ambiguous concepts that place is used alongside. So an understanding of locality or place or the local, understanding of home, so that kind of sense of a secure place that's a kind of a safe place, a retreat from the world or a haven. It's often allied with ideas about communities of locality, so the kind of social relations and different kinds of networks that exist in geographical areas or places. And then finally, the kind of less tangible issues of belonging and connection. And we use the word attachment a lot here as well. So connections between different people living in the same place, but also fundamentally between people and that specific environment or location. So all of this is in some way challengingly and multidimensionally captured by this idea of place, which is why it's tricky. So if we look at some of the academic writing, particularly in human geography, there's an emphasis upon this idea of meaning. So, and if you go back several decades, there's this fairly simple idea that space is a kind of an area that turns into a place when we endow it with something special, and that's that kind of connection we have. We name places in the world. If you think about explorers, they put flags on a place and say, "We've been here. This is ours." So there's a sense of maybe appropriation or identification or attachment. Suddenly, lots of things come into play, and it has some kind of meaning. And I think if you take any place you can think of in the world, it might be Liverpool, it might be London, it might be anywhere. Instantly, it's not just a geographical area. You've got ideas already there somehow about what it's like to live there, what kind of people live there, what kind of place it is, its dimensions, its culture, etc. So that's the meaning dimension which human geographers have stressed over time. And what Massey's work is important for is to stress the political dimensions of place, to say that places are not static entities, they're dynamic over time, but that process of change is in some ways it can be signs of struggle, that there's a politics to place and there's a politics to changing places. And also Massey's work is very useful for preventing any sense of romanticization that place attachment is necessarily a good thing, or that feeling connected to local areas is always a good thing, either for people living there or indeed people living everywhere else. That place can be very exclusionary, that in fact there can be an insularity. There can be, not necessarily, but there can be an insularity associated with feeling strong connections to place. So we should always be critical, I think, and careful in the way in which we talk up place, and be recognizing of perhaps some negative consequences of places in our lives, in the way our societies unfold, and also the limitations of taking a place-based perspective as well, or certainly a local perspective. And the relational idea is basically just to say that when we think about places, it's very important not to assume that they have kind of walls around them implicitly. So we think about London as a place in the southeast of England, but human geographers and other social scientists over many years have stressed the flows, connections, the ins and outs of what goes in and what goes out in terms of information, people, resources, and emphasizing the relations between places as much as the characteristics of a place in its own right. So all of those are fundamental to how we should be thinking about place. It's multidimensional. Again, this is going back to fundamental human geography scholarship in terms of characterizing place as a physical or geophysical location in the world with grid coordinates, etc., as a locale, which is a kind of a setting for social relations and expectations of what people do there or how people should behave there. And finally, and this is what I'm going to be talking about mostly today, is this attribute of place, which is about the subjective and the emotional qualities. And as somebody who came from the discipline of psychology in my undergraduate training, this was what really intrigued me about places. not just in other people, but in myself, a sense of there are certain places that mean something to me in the world. And how do we best understand that? And what are the implications of those? And this refers to our identities as well, that often who we are is bound up with where we are. I'm a Londoner, or I'm a country person, or I'm a person from the southwest of England, or whatever it might be. So there's spatial dimensions to identities as much as anything else. And of course, the poets and the playwrights and the novelists have been here already. And there's a nice quote from James Joyce, who famously wrote a book called Dubliners as well. So moving on to sense of place and just trying to unwrap that a bit more, and again, emphasizing the complexity of this academic terrain, it's just to say that underneath this broad umbrella term of sense of place, of these less tangible dimensions of people, environment, relations around place, we've got a number of different ways that scholars have, I guess, identified these connections. So the emotional bonds are characterized by the concept of place attachment. The identity connections are reflected in literatures on place identity, a place and identity. The sense of belonging with people can be referred to around sense of community. And then there are these two other attributes that I've come to appreciate more over time, and perhaps were less prevalent in the early literatures on place attachment in particular, in environmental psychology. And that's to do with lived experience, a kind of a concern with what it's like for the people who actually are there. What is the tenor of their everyday life experiences? What are the kind of challenges that exist for different communities, sometimes in really difficult environments or social or economic circumstances? And why should we pay attention, if we're interested in climate change or climate mitigation, to that lived experience? And then finally, and very importantly, an idea about expertise. Gradually increasing recognition that there are multiple forms of knowledge, and that one of the types of expertise we can and should perhaps recognize is local knowledge, which is knowledge that stems from living in a place over time. And I think this is quite important when we're thinking about technology or infrastructure deployment, because the experts who parachute in to understand it and drive that process often underestimate the value of local knowledges. And it's not easy to integrate local knowledges into planning and deployment processes either. So it raises a whole range of issues, which I think are challenges, but also opportunities when it comes to climate mitigation. Yeah, so I'll move on here, just to talk about something which I would describe as a place-sensitive mindset. And Tim Cresswell's work in human geography is very important here. It's taking us into matters I would call of ontology and epistemology. So when we look at the world, when we look at social life in terms of place, we see different kinds of things. And I'm really attuned to this because I think different academic disciplines, different social science disciplines look at the world in different ways. In fact, different disciplines. So engineers see the world in terms of, say, technologies, projects, etc. Economists see the world in terms of financial flows and resources and decisions around money. Psychologists typically see the world, in my experience, in terms of the experience of individuals and the mental life of individuals, the kind of decision making of individuals. And geographers, I think, and landscape architects and those other spatial disciplines are interesting because they see the world in through a geographical lens. And it does bring quite interesting differences then when it comes to technology deployment. If you look at the picture on the right, to me, it suggests primarily an engineering-driven policy perspective on net zero. We can see these big technologies. There are no people present here in any way. It's not an identifiable location. And I think often the visual imagery we use to describe our ideas about climate mitigation and net zero are quite revealing. And I wrote about this some time ago in distinguishing between what you could call a place approach to infrastructure deployment and the siting approach. And so much we see the siting approach, which is, for better or for worse, a stripping away of emotions, of culture, of connections, of the things which deal with the meaning dimensions of place, the way I just described. And I think we need to put them back in. So much of what I'll be talking about today is trying to understand infrastructure deployment in a meaningful sense in terms of place and the people who are attached to those places. This is a matter of justice as well, and people like David Schlossberg and others have talked about this quite credibly, I think, and persuasively. So when we talk about technology or infrastructure deployment, we are talking about large-scale infrastructures that make really large changes to particular places and landscapes in the world. And that can really challenge and undermine and threaten existing senses of place or place attachments. And that's a justice issue. We have to be thinking about the procedural dimensions of change, the recognition of the issues involved and the people impacted, and the distribution of outcomes in relation to changing places intentionally through technology deployment. And we're beginning to grapple with this quite successfully, I think, through ideas of just transition, which are proceeding around the world and are informing the restructuring of societies and economies to move away from carbon-intensive industries. But the policy focus tends to be mainly about jobs, about skills, about retraining, and it misses out a lot on the less tangible dimensions to do with place and community that I think are also vital to make just transition work. So countering that and complementing those perspectives with ideas from environmental psychology and human geography, I think are really important. And there's a whole bundle of literatures over the last 20 years, which came from, I think, mainly challenges around the siting of renewable energy technologies like wind energy that have talked about the problems with defining community objections in terms of NIMBYism. And here I would go back. Kate was introducing me a few minutes ago. Kate Burningham's paper back in 2000. It is not accurate. It is not helpful. It is pejorative to describe community objections in terms of NIMBYism. But it's also incumbent, I think, on social scientists to come up with alternative ideas and theories and frameworks. And one of the strands I've tried to employ over the last couple of decades on that is to think through the lens of place and fairness. And that's really difficult because conflicts over infrastructure siting are very difficult. They tend to involve different kinds of actors, like commercial companies or multinational companies, or policymakers at the national level, or protest groups and local action groups or local residents, each of which bring different kinds of ways of thinking about the world, different kinds of rationalities and values to those conflicts. And what Drenthon helpfully pointed out some time ago is that these are often not commensurate. And one of the reasons why I think community objectors are often poorly understood is that they're speaking a language of place particularity. They're in his paper, he talked about an ethic of the particular. So, from this perspective, there is only one Exeter, for example. You can't substitute it for anywhere else. It's its own unique characteristics and place. And therefore, you can't tamper with it that quickly and assume it's just like any other locality. There are fundamental perspectives there which need to be taken into account. But there are also opportunities. So place-sensitive thinking, I think, can provide policymakers and industry and other people with new kinds of thinking towards infrastructure deployment. And some of the ideas that have come up in the literature are about the fit or lack of fit often between a given place and a given proposed technology. But it also talks about ideas about how you can make them fit better. What would that involve? Who would you need to speak to? How would you need to scope that? Thinking about technology deployment that could be place enhancing rather than threatening to existing places or disrupting place attachments. And some quite provocative work back in 2000 by Britain in terms of what a place-based wind energy project might look like, and how you can take ideas about electricity generation technologies and the unique characteristics of particular locations and try and at least solve the challenges of bringing them together in a way that is both successful in terms of broader technology trajectories and national policy goals, but also in tangible ways that make sense and connect technologies into the fabric of places and the communities of people who live there. So all of that, I suppose, was a kind of an introduction to some of the theoretical ideas which have come from lots and lots of different empirical research studies around the world, looking at how ideas of place and fairness can be useful for thinking about in relation to climate mitigation. And I suppose there's been an interesting turn in my career, I suppose, over the last 5 years, shifting from, say, pylons and power lines or wind farms, which are often sited in areas where there aren't many people living, areas which are often rural, the countryside, coastal areas, areas people retire to or go to because of a sense of tranquility and contact with nature. And I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes, and I better go quickly. I'm actually getting behind, to talk about a recent project which was done with a range of academics in universities of Leeds, Sussex, and Manchester, as well as colleagues of mine in Exeter, which was about delivering a just transition in industrial clusters. So there's no way the UK is going to meet its net zero targets if it isn't also going to industrialize high emitting industrial areas. So here I'm talking about places like Grangemouth, Ellesmere Port in the northwest of England, Milford Haven in the southwest of England. And I have to say, these are not places people typically choose to take holidays in. They are places with large scale infrastructure facilities, industrial facilities. They emit gases, noxious pollutants. They are hazardous places where explosions can take place, but they're also communities where workers and local people live and make their lives over time. So part of this project has been about trying to understand the local dimensions of net zero through industrial decarbonisation. And it's led to specific case studies in these three places. These are coastal towns with histories and cycles of industrialisation, whaling and fishing, if you go back several centuries, wartime importance in terms of shipping coming in and out and crossing the Atlantic, more recently oil and gas refining since the 50s, and now these proposed net zero technologies like carbon capture and hydrogen production facilities. But these are vast facilities, really large scale, major investments, lots of multinational companies. But as the pictures on the right show, these are places where people live, where people call home, where people live in community settings, and they're mindful of their histories. In the top picture, you've got a gentleman at one of our focus groups holding up a picture of what the town used to look like in the 70s and talking about the changes that have happened in that place and what might happen in the future with these net zero technologies to be deployed there. Yeah, I'll move on. So we did various kinds of research as part of this IDRIC research project, and these different projects actually that we brought together under a social science banner. First of all, we did some interviews with stakeholders based in policy and industry organizations, and we asked them about place. We asked them about the future of these places. We're all familiar, I guess, with 2050 net zero targets or 2045 targets around the UK. But what will Milford Haven look like in 2050? What will Grangemouth look like as a place in 2050? What will Ellesmere Port look like? And what will it be like to live in 2050? And when we asked the stakeholders these kinds of open questions, all we got back from them mainly was talk about technologies. It was about pipelines, it was about chimneys, it was about new factories, it was about new kinds of industrial processes and efficiencies. There was very little emphasis in the discourse on places and communities in those less tangible ways that I just described. It's not that they didn't talk about place at all. They did. But if they did, they talked about it in terms of marketing and branding. How do we make this place attractive to bring companies in, to bring industry into this area in a kind of competitive sense? Like, why would they choose here rather than somewhere else in the UK or somewhere else in the world? We also found that community engagement at the local level in these industrial clusters that are emerging across the UK was really, really limited. It hadn't really got off the ground at all, and it was often fragmented. So it might happen upon particular planning applications going in, but the idea of engaging with publics around overall visions of industrial clusters didn't seem to be happening at all. Yeah, so it was highly deficient. So what we did as part of our research work was to travel to these places and these communities, to spend time there, to try and understand their histories and cultures. And I haven't got much time, so I'd very briefly point out this picture on the top, which is taken in Milford Haven. I remember the day we visited, there were four elderly gents sitting outside taking in the sun. They're all volunteers. They're people who've lived in the community for decades. They're in their 70s now, all full of stories about this place and the way it's changed over time, how it's moved through different cycles of industry that come and go, and yet the community endures in some way. So what's it like to live there faced with the prospects of this large-scale investments in these new technologies to create net zero technology? So we ran focus groups to make sure that we could tap into host community perspectives. And we also ran stakeholder workshops, which tried to provide facilitated spaces for community residents and government stakeholders and industry to come together. And they actually proved quite successful in bringing these different sectors and different kinds of people together. And trust is really important there. Maybe it was because we were coming from the University of Exeter or from IDRIC or from universities, but we were able to have conversations that it's fair to say local government stakeholders have found really difficult to get off the ground, or even that industry have found it challenging, whether because they're complacent or they don't understand the challenges, but they haven't really happened before. So trust came out of our research as an absolutely crucial issue, but it was something that typically was simply not there. And there was huge skepticism around the claims being made for these technologies and why people should engage with consultations, given the histories of the lack of responsiveness by stakeholders to those in the past. So a kind of a disengagement and a mistrust. It's also quite clear when you speak to residents that they have pride in place, that they do feel strong attachments and a strong sense of connection to these places. They don't want to go and live anywhere else. They do feel that an industrial place is a good place to live. But in some ways, they regret the kinds of changes that have taken place over the last 3 or 4 decades. They look back to the 80s and the 70s and remember thriving communities where major local employers seem to play a much more positive and kind of involved role in the local community in terms of funding facilities and activities and educational offerings than happens today. And there's also a lot of concern about the amount of money being channeled into these places, both from public and private contexts. And what does that mean when we've got places like Milford Haven, where there is food banks, food poverty, fuel poverty, etc.? Who is actually going to benefit from these trumpeted changes of industrial cluster decarbonisation? So what we've tried to do in the project is to provide a kind of a set of actionable knowledge in the form of a place-based just transition framework. And so here we're really speaking to stakeholders, and we're trying to address the lack of place-sensitive thinking as much as providing a new theory to academics for that reason. And we're trying to bring these different ideas about place sensitivity, rethinking infrastructure deployment as a place-making process rather than just an engineering deployment process that impacts host communities in tangible and intangible ways and shapes sense of place, and also foregrounds this idea of just transition, but in a broader sense beyond simply socioeconomics, although obviously that's very important to ensure the appropriate distribution of positive benefits of change. So prioritizing and advocating a place-sensitive mindset and thinking through the different kinds of claims for justice in terms of procedure, recognition, and distribution, and different facets of local impact that host communities raise in their concerns about the future and how they've been changed in the past. So again, I'm going to rattle through this. Apologies. This is a general framework that we've tried to produce. And in the center, we have the three pillars of environmental justice in different ways. So recognition justice through ideas about sensitivity to these less tangible matters of place and host community experience and lived experience and local knowledge. We've got advocacy here for genuine community engagement, not just box ticking or tokenistic engagement, to use Shelley Arnstein's language. And then finally, making sure that there is distributive justice in the way in which benefits are allocated from these new massive technology deployments that are being scoped. And if you look at the circle around the inner ring, you've got these 6 different themes under place that I just wanted to emphasize. So encouraging pride in place, recognizing the changes have occurred in these places over time. So not just assuming that history starts today with carbon capture, but actually you've got to think about these places in terms of oil and gas in the 70s, the kind of experiences of problems with local gas refineries and flaring that people live with on a day-to-day basis, and the concerns and risk perceptions associated with that. The grounding of benefits locally, I've mentioned. Building reciprocity is something to do with connecting, with social capital, with building trust, and making sure that the communities are not being done to in this process, but actually are seen as a bona fide stakeholder. Engaging place visions means thinking through what we want the future to look like, what each of these places in 2050 might look like, and doing appropriate kinds of engagement mechanisms to solicit local knowledge. And then finally, just unlocking, respecting, and recognizing the residents' knowledges from living in this place over many decades. On the outer sides of the framework are things which connect up the local to wider issues and recognize the challenges of change. So trade-offs and tensions are going to happen. It won't be easy to reconcile different parts of communities or different sectors between government, industry, residents, particularly. We have to find ways of expecting conflict or tension and trying to reach at least some kind of recognition of how we can move around those through engagement and participation. We have to build trust, recognizing that these new technologies do not have legitimacy and credibility as yet. There's a lot of skepticism about the claims that are being proposed for emissions reductions and positive benefits, including economic ones for communities. So legitimacy has to be built. It cannot be taken for granted, especially given previous histories. And finally, net zero, in particular industrial decarbonisation in the UK, has been such a top-down process so far, a kind of a government-led UK government central department DESNZ initiative. And there's real challenges in making these clusters work in terms of connecting local councils, connecting across administrative boundaries, and bringing host communities into those conversations too, in terms of how we better do the governance of net zero across scale. So the project led to a number of recommendations, taking the perspective of host communities, and that's not easy, but it's to some extent a foundational dimension of empathy. Not just seeing the world through our own eyes, but trying to imagine the perspectives of others too. Providing integrated and accessible information about the change that's coming down the track. Support diverse forms of participation. To co-produce future narratives of change, taking an evidence-based approach to engagement. We found little evidence of what I would call robust evaluation of the engagement and the community benefit provision that was going on, and maybe a bit of complacency around that, which I think needs to change. Delivering positive local benefits and attempting to rebuild trust. And that means starting from an assumption that people are not necessarily going to believe everything that you say because of past histories. And you need to go in there then recognizing that and building relationships over time, tangibly showing positive benefits around that. So that's largely what I was going to say today, and I'll finish up now. Time is ticking away. Just want to signpost 1 or 2 last resources. So in terms of resources and things you can take away from this talk, I've mentioned that place-based just transitions framework, and you can find that by going online to the IDRIC website and Googling place-based just transitions in industrial clusters. And there's loads of resources on that webpage, including a policy brief, etc. I've written recently a systematic review of 20 years of social science research into this topic with Adam Peacock. That's available in the journal RESR. And then finally, just to flag a piece of work that we've been doing in Access over the last year, which is our task force on net zero and social transformations. So the outputs of this work, of this task force, which has convened an interdisciplinary team, are going to be made available in early June. And I think it's useful to signpost this because you know, you can come away from a talk like this thinking, well, Patrick thinks that if we get place right and fairness right, then we're going to get net zero. But there's a lot more to the social science dimensions of net zero and technology deployment than these. So I don't want to overclaim the importance of place, but it is important in my view. And I think the manifesto that we're coming up with in the task force is a good way of seeing that whole landscape as an overview, which I think is quite useful moving forward. Well, anyway, you can read that 2002 paper if you're interested, but just to say that we need to go beyond ephemeral, superficial appropriations of place. If we can ground net zero and industrial decarbonisation in social science theory and research, we have a stronger foundation for moving forward and actually reaching ambitious policy targets, and I think having some hope for the future as well. So thank you very much indeed. That's me then.
Thank you, Patrick. That was absolutely fascinating, sort of whistle-stop tour of so much.